I'm Stan Stokes. Back quite a while ago, I did that mural back in the year 2000, 2001. And getting to do the mural, I got to know an awful lot of the Tuskegee Airmen, and it started a relationship that we've had for a long time. Most of the guys that I knew were long since gone. There's a couple of them that are still alive, amazingly. And Harry Stewart, who's just a prince of a gentleman, he's still alive. In fact, I wrote his age down here somewhere. Well, maybe I didn't. Anyway, I think Harry, at this point, is now 100? So doing really, really well. And if you've been around the Air Museum, you know that our Mustang is painted up honoring the Tuskegee Airmen. And the fellow who we painted up as his airplane, Bob Friend, I got to know him back just after doing the mural. I've done some paintings of him and his Mustang and everything. Got to know it really, really well. And when the time came for us to choose a paint scheme for our Mustang, I thought there wouldn't be any better Mustang to do than to do Bob Friend's Mustang. So I kind of talked to him a little bit about it, careful not to say that that's what we're doing or anything, just seeing if he had any photos or anything. And of course he didn't have any photos. Our director here at the museum, Fred Bell, I told him about him, and the two of us went down and had lunch down in Carson with Bob. And I knew that the two of them would hit it off, which they really did hit it off. So it was kind of a no-brainer to do it as his airplane. It took about 6 different trips down there, having lunch with him at his favorite little Chinese restaurant, talking to him to find out exactly how everything looked. If you've looked at our Mustang, the nose art is Bunny, and that was his airplane. The girl on the side of it is how he remembered she looked. It took a lot of me talking to him and pulling the information out of his head, and me sketching things out and everything. We finally worked it out to where I said, "Is this like it?" And he said, "Yeah, that looks good, that's fine." So that's our Mustang, but that cemented our relationship with him. Now, it just so happens that another Tuskegee Airman who I had met but just casually and didn't know the connection, Harry Stewart, the two of them are brother-in-laws. They went to flight school at Tuskegee together. They hadn't known each other before then. They had a couple of weekend breaks where Bob wanted to go home and see his family and his mom and siblings and everything. And Harry went with him. And so here these guys are 20 years old, and Harry winds up meeting Bob's siblings, one of who was a very nice-looking young lady. And they wound up getting married. So the two of them were brother-in-laws. And Harry and his wife were married until just a few years ago when she passed away. But a lot of connections back there. I'm going to start the whole thing with Harry. I'm going to talk about 12 different individuals and what the experience in World War II meant to them after the war. Harry had become a fighter pilot. Harry went overseas. It was fairly far along with the war. The war only in Europe had just a few months left to go. By the time Harry arrived, they were flying brand new P-51D Mustangs. Until then, they had been given hand-me-down airplanes. But much to their surprise, they were doing so good that the Army Air Force decided it's time to give them brand new airplanes. So they had brand new Mustangs. Okay. There we go. Catch up with where I should be. Here's Harry back in his cadet days. And this would have been at Tuskegee Army Airfield when he was a brand new pilot. This is, you can tell, he's a little bit older, still down at Tuskegee. Now he goes overseas. And this is because on one mission he flew, fairly early on in the whole thing, he was tootling along after their escort mission was over with, and happened to come across some Focke-Wulf 190Ds that were heading in the same direction, but he was behind them. And as he was pulling up close to them, he realized they have no idea I'm here. So he just kept pulling up closer and closer and closer, and then let one of the wingmen have it, and that plane immediately burst into flames and went out. And at that point, the pilots and the rest of the Focke-Wulfs went, oh no, and broke in different directions. Harry was able to stay with another one and shoot it down. And at that point, just as Harry was thinking, I've just shot 2 of them down, he saw tracers coming from behind him, and he thought, oh my God, they're behind me. And one of them had gotten behind him on his tail, and Harry led that Focke-Wulf for a really wild ride all the way down to the deck, trying to shake him, and he said he would do everything he could. Every time he looked back there, the Focke-Wulf was still there, and some more tracers had come flying by him. He said he was certain he was going to be dead any second. And he got right down and was going in between the trees and everything, and he said all of a sudden, it felt like nobody was there. And he turned and he saw a big fireball behind him. The Focke-Wulf had hit something and crashed. So because he caused that crash, he got credit for that too. So this is him when he got back. 3. And years later, in our Mustang, we did the same pose. So this is Harry probably 7 or 8 years ago. And the most remarkable thing about Harry at this age, at this point he was just hitting 90 years old. We had several Tuskegee Airmen here that were really, really old, and most of them, their age showed. They were using walkers, wheelchairs, whatever. We pulled out the Mustang, opened it up. Greg standing back there, he was a part of this whole thing. One at a time, unless they said absolutely no, but I think they all decided to get up into the airplane. So very cautiously and with a lot of us around, we lifted them all up onto the wing and over into the thing, backed off, took photos, and then got them back out again and everything. When it came time for Harry, Harry jumped up like you're supposed to get on a Mustang, jumped into the thing, and there you can see him, jumped back out and jumped back down onto the ground. And this is at about 90. So we're all going, oh, I wish I had those genes. So anyway, he gets credit for the 3 Focke-Wulfs. At the end of the war, they all started realizing that even though they were very accomplished pilots and their mechanics were very accomplished, everybody involved were very accomplished, in civilian life, they wouldn't be working in aviation. It just wasn't open to them. No matter how accomplished they were, there were no openings in the civilian world for these pilots. So they stayed in. And any of you that have been in the military, when you get to the higher ranks, you know that unless there's an opening for a rank, you will not advance in rank. There has to be an opening for you to go to. They don't just give you bird colonels things to go up and just be a colonel. There has to be a reason why they need a colonel. Because these guys were all together, none of them were leaving, there weren't any openings, so they were all well below the rank that they should have been if they were in anybody else in the Air Force. So 1949 comes along and a very interesting thing happened. The Air Force decided to have a gunnery meet with fighters. And they decided to have 3 fighter airplanes plus the pilots and crew from every fighter group in the Air Force show up at what is now Nellis Air Force Base. They went through a whole 10-day thing of all the different ways you can use a fighter airplane, air-to-air, air-to-ground, rocketry, everything else. In the end, there were 3 of them that had come from the 332nd Fighter Group, which is the Red Tails. One of them was Harry, another one was James Harvey, and then the third was Alva Temple. The 3 of them had done spectacularly well. They had an alternate come along, and an alternate airplane. They weren't needed because these guys were perfect. Their airplanes flew perfect. In the end, they won the thing. And in 1949, 3 black guys beating everybody else in the Air Force was just shocking to the Air Force. They made no actual press release on what had happened. They had a big, giant trophy. Well, We're getting there. There's a painting I did of Harry commemorating the whole thing. And here's Harry with a painting from about 5 or 6 years ago. Here's Harry not too long ago. Harry and Bob, brother-in-laws. And at the William Tell, they were still flying their Thunderbolts. They knew really well. P-47Ns. Here are all three of them, plus their alternate. And Harry is the one who's got the helmet on with the white down to here. And James Harvey is the other guy in the center. And Alva Temple is the tall guy on the side. And that is Alva Temple, James Harvey, and Harry. And there's the painting I did commemorating that whole thing, the William Tell, and their winning of it. There's the trophy. Somehow, that trophy got lost by the Air Force. And nobody knew where it was, very conveniently and everything. There was a lady, a historian, who kind of took it to heart and searched and searched and searched. And she got permission to look in all the cubby holes at the Air Force Museum. And she found this in a little storage room. And it had been missing for, I think, 47 years. And it took another 5 years to get it on display, but it's now on display there. But that is them, all four of them, with the trophy. And I would say it's kind of a hard thing to lose, but it is there now. And if Ellie Zor hadn't spent all that time looking for it, it'd probably still be lost, unless somebody just accidentally found it. There was a side thing that happened afterwards. The Air Force, like I said, was quite embarrassed by the whole thing. The high-ups realized that there were these 3 black fighter pilots that had just shown up the rest of the Air Force. And somebody high up said, we don't want that to ever happen again. Let's shut down the 332nd Fighter Group and disperse them all within the Air Force. So that's what they did. Now, that sounds like kind of a bad thing. But if you remember the whole thing with rank, where they had not advanced in rank because there were no openings, they went into the regular Air Force, and suddenly there were all kinds of openings. And they all shot up in rank. They all started flying jets and everything else. And there's other people in here that I will tell you their stories about what happened. And some pretty spectacular things happened with them. But Benjamin O. Davis, who wasn't a part of that, was the most important person in the whole story of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was in the first group trained at Tuskegee. So this is the first 5 that survived the whole thing. They started off at 12. The original commanding officer down there just wanted to get rid of the whole thing. He just wanted to wash them all out. So he was able to wash out 7 of them. These guys were so good he couldn't wash them out no matter what he did. Now, Benjamin O. Davis is the tall one in the background with the mustache. He had grown up in the Army. His dad had been a general in the Army back when that was almost unheard of. He knew how to maneuver around within the Army growing up with it. Benjamin O. Davis was able to get himself into West Point. For 4 years, he was shunned at West Point. This is West Point in the early 30s. He wasn't spoken to. If he went into the mess hall, nobody would sit with him. He decided just to show him what he could do, and he wound up graduating number 36 in a class of 300 and something. So in spite of the whole thing, he did well. And that's what's going to happen with all of these people. They persevered, they did well in spite of everything thrown at them. So these are the first 5 guys. This is the same group, but in one of the AT-6 Texans at Tuskegee. This would have been at Tuskegee Army Airfield. Benjamin O. Davis is in the cockpit. And so the 5th person there is their flight instructor. Here he is. Looks like it was going to be a cold day flying an AT-6, but that's still at Tuskegee. This is when they went overseas. He's now flying a Mustang. He's in the Army Air Corps. Because he had been through West Point and everything, when he was at Tuskegee, he was made captain of the class. That was only a class of 5. but he was still made the captain. When they went overseas, he was in charge of the whole thing. He was savvy enough about Washington, D.C. and everything else to where there were quite a few times he had to leave Italy and come back to Washington, D.C. to talk to congressmen testifying in Congress. There was certain congressmen, generally from the South, that were trying to just end the whole thing. He made good enough arguments to where they kept the whole thing going. So he would go back and say, we're good for another little while. But that's him there. This is in his earlier Mustang, C model Mustang without the blown canopy, which is what he flew most of the time. But that's the flight gear, the oxygen mask, everything else as they wore when they were actually in combat. After World War II, he stayed in, like most of them, and he wound up flying F-86 Sabrejets in Korea. The F-86 in the foreground is him flying the F-86. So that is his F-86. He flew, I don't actually have down how many missions he flew, but he was a commanding officer of the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing in Korea. And once he left Korea, once the Korean War ended and everything, in 1953, he was promoted to Brigadier General. So he suddenly had a star. And at that point, he went through all kinds of different commands. 54, Director of Ops and Training, Far East Air Force Headquarters, Tokyo, and then advanced position of Vice Commander, 13th Air Force, Commanding Officer, Air Task Force 13, 1957. He arrived in Ramstein, Germany, Chief of Staff, 12th Air Force, U.S. Air Forces in Europe. Also in 1957, he assumed new duties as Chief of Staff for Operations, Headquarters, U.S. Air Forces in Europe, Wiesbaden, Germany. 1959, he was advanced to Major General. And then 1965 was promoted to Lieutenant General, so he's now got 3 stars. Same month, he was given the assignment as Chief of Staff for United Nations Command and U.S. Air Force in Korea. So he's making quite a name for himself. 1967, he assumed command of the 13th Air Force at Clark Air Base in the Republic of the Philippines. And then General Davis was assigned the Deputy Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Strike Command, Headquarters, MacDill Air Force Base, Florida. And at that point, he retired. You know, when you have 3 stars, it can be time to retire. And lived out the rest of the life pretty much in retirement because he'd already done enough. But he is the one that in 1996 was awarded his 4th star. It was a big ceremony and everything. So when he passed away, he was a 4-star general. So now somebody that took a completely different path, Herbert Carter. Oh, wait a second. There he is, 3-star general. And there he is, my painting with the 4th star. Now, I cheated a little bit and made him a little bit younger than he would have been. Now, Colonel Herbert Carter, he was class 42 FSE. Now, what that means is 1942, class F, so you're proceeding through the year, and SE means single engine, so he's being trained to be a single engine fighter pilot. When his class graduated, he was the 33rd one to have gotten his wing since the thing started. They were beginning to accelerate. They had a brand new commanding officer at Tuskegee, Noel Parrish. As soon as he took command there, after they had a really rough time with a couple of different COs, he took them, had a group like this and said, "You're my guys. We're going to do the best you can possibly do. There's not going to be any artificial roadblocks. If you're meant to be a fighter pilot, I will see to it that you become a fighter pilot." So they were really good, a really good fit and everything. He got his wings, started learning how to fly P-40 Warhawk. For a while there, before they got deployed, which took a long time, they had Tuskegee Army Airfield, and there were 3 other auxiliary airfields that they could land at. They weren't welcome anywhere else. So as they were flying, like the P-40, they had to make certain that wherever they were going to land was one of those 4 airfields. Occasionally, somebody had to land somewhere else because of weather or fuel or something. And it was pretty much pointed out to them that they weren't welcome. So they still had everything to prove. A lot of people thought they weren't supposed to be there or anything. So they finally deployed. He's one who went to North Africa with the very first deployment with the 99th Fighter Squadron. They were flying, this is getting into the weeds slightly, but they weren't flying your normal P-40 Warhawk. They were flying Rolls-Royce Merlin-powered P-40s, which were L models and I think F models. And they were a bit faster, more capable P-40s. Not as good as the Mustang was going to be, but still much better. They started showing everybody that they actually were good pilots while they were in North Africa. And then they moved a whole bunch of them over to Italy just in time for Anzio. And at that point, they were given P-39 Airacobras to fly, which everything the Germans were flying was much faster than the Airacobra was. They were given the duty of going out and protecting the convoy ships as they were coming in for the landings at Anzio. When they spotted a German airplane or an Italian airplane, the best they could do is go up and let the enemy see that they're there, and they said generally the enemy would turn and leave. If they ever got into a dogfight, they weren't going to win a dogfight between the P-39 and anything that the enemy was flying. So they knew that they had the best, or the worst airplanes that could be given to them. They flew the P-39s faithfully, they did their jobs, they protected the convoys, and when the landings were over, and they were thinking, now what are we going to do with these dog of an airplanes? Much to their delight, they were given P-47 Thunderbolts from the 325th Fighter Group. Now, this is a little inside information that hardly anybody seems to know, but I've researched it enough to know this is true. The 325th Fighter Group had yellow and black diagonal checkerboards all over the tail. The entire tail was covered with yellow and black checkerboards. They were called the Checkerboard Clan. All the fighters had to have distinctive markings for their groups so everybody in the midst of an air battle could tell who everybody was. So a bomber or another fighter from a different group could see that Thunderbolt and see it was yellow and black checkerboard and know that's 325th. You know, he's not one of mine. They've got their own mission. So the 325th was being given Mustangs. They flew all their airplanes over to Ramstein, Italy, where the 332nd, the Tuskegee Airmen were, and said, here you go. So they were all used airplanes, but the 332nd was delighted to get them because Thunderbolt was quite an airplane. Big beasts of an airplane that could carry anything you'd put underneath it. 8 50 caliber machine guns. A really good engine. The airplane was fast. It had high altitude capabilities. So they knew they were getting a really good airplane. Benjamin O. Davis, the commanding officer, said, we've got a mission in about 3 days to fly, and we can't fly that with those yellow and black checkerboard tails on all those airplanes. So you guys figure out what to do and do it right now. These fighter groups were all a part of the 15th Air Force. That was the Mediterranean Air Force for the Army Air Forces. One thing in particular with everything that the 15th Air Force had, they all had red noses one way or another. A red cowling, a red spinner, something red on the front of the engine denoting they were 15th Air Force airplanes. That meant that there was a lot of red paint around. So all these guys had to do was find out where the vast stores of red paint were and go and raid the thing, which they did and brought it back, and paintbrushes for everybody, and they spent about 36 hours, everybody in the 332nd Fighter Group, painting the checkerboard tails red. And that's where the red tails came from. So the very first use of the red tails for Tuskegee Airmen was with those Thunderbolts. They flew the missions. They did a great job with it. The war ends. Gene Carter, Herbert Eugene Carter, but everybody knew him as Gene, came back to Tuskegee. And he got his BS degree in industrial education in 1955. Later on, in 1969, he received an MA degree in administration. He was in the Air Force Reserves at that point, but he retired in 1969. In his retirement, he served at Tuskegee University as Associate Dean of Student Services and Administration until 1985. Now, so he spent pretty much the rest of his life, because when I caught up with him, he was still living in Tuskegee, and that would have been about 2005. So pretty much his entire life in Tuskegee. He'd kept flying as long as he could. He did flight instruction. One of the people, actually I keep forgetting to do this. Back at Tuskegee, that's the main administration hall in Tuskegee. There he is in 2008 when it became Tuskegee National Historic Site. You ask, why is he on here? Lionel Richie and everybody in the Commodores grew up in Tuskegee. Gene Carter knew them all. He taught him how to fly. So Lionel Richie became a pilot in the hands of Herbert Carter. And in 2008, when they had the big ceremony making it national site down there, the Moton Field National Historic Site, they had a big wingding over in Montgomery. I went to it with Rusty Burns. And he shows up, and there was a big piano there and a couple of synthesizers, and another guy shows up, and he goes through all of his songs. And for the most part, we were standing 10, 15 feet away from him. And in between songs, everybody was talking to him. And you could tell he just loved those guys. So that's why Lionel Richie's thrown in. This is from Tuskegee. Now, Alex Jefferson, here he is as a brand new cadet. You can tell the symbol up on his hat, that's a cadet symbol. And his whole thing turned out to be a little bit different, and not as he really planned. This is him after he was an Army Air Corps pilot. You can tell by all the decorations on him and everything. Here's a painting I did of him when he was in combat over in Europe. He flew 18 successful combat missions and won the 19th not quite successful because he got shot down. They were strafing a radar station in France, Toulon, France, and his airplane was hit, and he bailed out of the airplane. He hit the ground and immediately had German rifles pointed at him. So he became a POW. They took him to Poland, and he was in some of the really bad camps. He said that the Germans treated him no better, no different than anybody else. So, go figure. Here he is much later in life. When he got back, he became instructor pilot at Tuskegee Army Airfield for quite a while. Stayed in Air Force Reserves until 1969. Received an MA degree in education in 1954. Moved back to Detroit where he was born and became a teacher in the Detroit public school system, and then was appointed assistant principal until his retirement in 1979. And while he was doing that, he authored a book that you can go on Google and buy about his whole experiences and everything. It's Red Tails Captured, Red Tails Free. He passed away last year on June 22nd at the age of 100. And he was one of those guys that you could sit down and just talk to. He was just a great guy. Here he is in 2008 at the Moton Field National Historic Site opening. So he was very active. He's the one that got to cut the ribbon to open up the National Historic Site. So here he is with all the politicians. Okay, Bob Friend, Our Mustang's painted up honoring him. This is him when he was a cadet. Here he is after real early in his career, but he's no longer a cadet. And same thing here. And always very dashing and was a ladies' man. Just between you and me, he wound up being married 8 times. This is his Mustang. He shot down a Messerschmitt. This is his Mustang. He's releasing his wingtip tank or wing tanks because you did not want to get into a combat situation with all that weight and drag underneath the airplane. So generally, when they would take off from England or in their case Italy, heading out to escort the bombers or something, the first leg would be burning the fuel out of the drop tanks. And that way, if they had to drop the drop tanks, they weren't dropping fuel. Another thing was that the tank right behind them, which is now the passenger seat in our Mustang, there was a big tank there. And when the airplanes took off from their air base, whether it was Italy or England, they took off overweight and out of CG, which meant they were out of center of gravity, very, very tail heavy. And until they burned off the fuel in the back tank there behind the pilot, the plane flew very tail heavy. They were not an easy thing to fly when they were in that situation. The pilots had to be very good and very careful. So here's a handsome Bob. Another painting I did of his Mustang. Here's Bob about 2012, something like that, and he was signing some prints that I had done. Help if I flip the page here. He stayed in the Air Force after the war, had the typical thing of flying P-40s, then P-39s, going into Thunderbolts. He was in the middle of the action on everything. There were several different combats that I brought up, and he said, oh yeah, I was right there. And one where they had a guy that they were grooming to take over for Benjamin O. Davis to be commander of the whole unit, who they were flying low over the Adriatic, and the water was still, and it was kind of gray. And Bob said, well, you could look out, and you couldn't see any horizon line or anything. And the guy who was being groomed to be CO flew into the water. And he hit the water, bounced, and I had read that he did a roll over the top of another, that was a Thunderbolt, and hit the water, and that was the end of him. The airplane that he did the roll over was Bob. Bob said, yeah, watch him go like that. He said, oh my God. So a lot of excitement there and everything. Bob stayed in the Air Force. He took a little bit different path. He didn't wind up in Korea, but he wound up doing test flying for the Air Force at Wright-Patterson. And some of the things he would be doing were cold weather flying, where they would freeze an airplane to where it had ice all over it, and they go fly it and see how it flew. See if things broke on the airplane. He flew B-47 Stratojets, which is a big 6-engined, early swept-wing jet bomber. And he and a couple others at Wright-Patterson worked out a maneuver that was called the nuclear bomb lob. And back in the early days of airplanes carrying nuclear bombs, they knew that any plane dropping a nuclear bomb was probably going to get wiped out by that blast. So with the B-47, they would come in with a fair amount of altitude, and as they were approaching the target, they would put the thing into a dive, get it going as fast as they could, and then at a very low level, pull up and do half of a loop. And as the plane was coming up like this, when it was passing between, I think he said it was like 47 degrees or something like that, the nuclear bomb would automatically go out of the belly of the airplane and go in that direction. And the B-47 would continue on and actually start heading down to build speed back up again and roll out of being upside down and go as fast as it could the other way. And even at that, they knew they were going to be hit really hard with the pressure wave and everything else. It was very dicey. He said, fortunately, nobody ever had to really do it. But typical of what they were up against on doing that type of thing, he said they were beginning to show a lot of wear stress cracks on the B-47 wings. And he came out there one morning, and there was somebody from Boeing out there on top of the airplane. So he climbed up, and the crew chief was up there on his particular airplane. And the stress cracks all had patches put on top of them. And he said to the guy, well, from Boeing, does that take care of the problem? He said, no, but you don't have to see him anymore. So they were flying B-47s doing that maneuver with cracks showing up in the wings. So he continues on. One of the more interesting things he did from 1958 to 1963, he headed up the Air Force's Project Blue Book. And that was the Air Force's official study of UFOs. And in conversations over lunch and everything, I brought that up quite a few times. And he was happy to talk about things. And he said that 95% of what was brought to them, eventually they could identify as something, so it was no longer an unidentified flying object. So there was a lot of things going on that people didn't know about, that they would see and they thought, oh, that's a UFO. But he said there was about 5% of things where he said they had no idea what they were, and they never did have an idea what they were. He was very open-minded about possibly aliens. He just said that the closest planet to here that could be habitable is so far away, it would take them so many light years to get here. He said they would have to conquer time travel to be able to do it. And then why would they come here? And I asked him about Roswell, and he said, well, that was just simply a broken arrow. And I kind of looked puzzled, you know what a broken arrow is? And I said, I'm not sure. He said, well, that's where we accidentally lose a nuclear weapon. And he said a B-29 had been flying over Roswell, and something malfunctioned, and all of a sudden the nuclear weapon was no longer in the B-29. Everybody midday was happily going through their day at Roswell, New Mexico, and they heard this thing screaming down out of the sky and make a really, really loud thud right outside of town. And everybody went out and looked, and there was a big thing of dust and debris and everything. And a few braver souls started kind of heading over that way to see what it was. But the Air Force was there almost instantaneously and cordoned things off. And just military people all over the place, feds all over the place and everything. And the local citizens couldn't get close to anything. The press started showing up. And he said, it was something like 4 or 5 days into the whole thing, they called a press conference. And the Air Force gentleman that was running the press conference was trying to dodge around saying anything definitively. And one of the press said, well, we understand it was a UFO. And he said you could tell in their minds that, okay, we can say it's a UFO and it'll get everybody all worked up, UFO. Or we can say it's a nuclear weapon that we dropped on your town, and which could be absorbed by the Air Force better. And they went, oh, alien. So the Air Force officer said it could be a flying saucer. And that's when the whole flying saucer thing started up. So, but he said in reality, it was a nuke that hit just outside of town. And that's why the Air Force was there immediately cleaning it all up and everything else. And everything else has just been pure distractions on the whole thing, because the Air Force has never wanted to admit that they tried to drop a bomb, a nuclear bomb on Roswell, New Mexico. So you just don't do that. Okay, he also, a little bit later on, served as assistant deputy launch vehicle on space launch vehicles such as the Titan, Alice, Delta rockets, and the Space Shuttle. So dealing with rockets. And then he served foreign technology program director, where he identified and monitored research and development programs related to national security. So he leaves the Air Force at that point, rank of colonel, and is trying to figure out what he's going to do. And he befriended this fellow who was a Chinese American, one of those absolutely brilliant guys. Was born in Los Angeles. And this guy was trying to start up a company to make equipment for satellites and space probes. And Bob thought, sure, okay. So he joined the company, and until he actually retired at a very advanced age, he was with Stanford Mu Corporation in Carson, and they made different things for all kinds of satellites, things that are thousands and thousands, millions of light years out there in space and everything. One of the things that they made a reaction motor. In space, you have to have something that can withstand being very, very cold, but can instantaneously make thrust and then shut it off again. So there's a couple of tanks, and then there's two different fuels in there that when they touch, they have spontaneous combustion. So you have a nozzle, you have two valves, and all you have to do is open those valves, shut the valves. And for that split second, you have thrust. So those are on all of our space probes going out there. They're Stanford Mu Corporation. So that's how he spent the last while of his productive life until he joined up with us, and every time that Mustang went anywhere, Bob was there. So great fellow. Okay. I don't see Greg around. Let me check the time. I can keep you here all day if you'd like. Well, there's the painting I did of Bob that's in our Hall of Fame. There's Bob at his retirement. This is Bob with just a small smattering of his family. When you have 8 wives, you get an awful lot of in-laws. Okay, Roscoe Brown. Roscoe Brown was one of those spectacular pilots in World War II. He flew the other Bunny. San Diego Air and Space Museum's Mustang is painted up as his. It's Bunny with IE. Ours is Bunny with a Y. And they both actually were. There's a painting I did of him a long time ago. And that's him in his Mustang, either about to go out on a mission or having just come back from a mission. Here's a painting I did of what he did that was pretty spectacular. They had an escort mission over Berlin. And it was a very big mission with an awful lot of airplanes. Their whole thing was to protect B-17s from the Germans. And right over downtown Berlin, they're flying along. They generally would be doing crisscross things, keeping their speed up 500 feet or so above the bombers. He said he looked up, and out of the corner of his eye, he'd caught something. He looked up, and there were contrails up there. And he went, that's jets. We've heard about jets. We're about to find out what jets are about. And they knew that the jets, the 262, the Messerschmitt 262, was 100 miles an hour faster than their Mustangs, which isn't good if you're trying to duke it out with somebody. So they're trying to maneuver around to get between themselves and the jets that are up there, but the jets up there still haven't left their formation. And he glances down and he sees some coming up from below. So that's just a diversion to get everybody looking up there, is the jets, the German jets were coming up from below. He sees one in particular that's kind of over here, coming up, heading towards some bombers. He rolls over to the side and lines up with it, and he's pulling up like this as it's climbing. And he said, I had no idea how far I needed to lead shooting at the thing, because it wasn't in the books. So he said, I just pulled the nose up a little bit more and shot out a burst. And he said, lo and behold, the right engine started to burn. And as the right engine started to burn, the pilot ejected out of it. Those things had rudimentary ejection seats in them, the Messerschmitt 262 jet. Without that, there's no way a pilot was going to get out of it. Within about 90 seconds, 3 of the 332nd Mustangs shot down a German jet. So there were 3 of them. Charles Lane and who's the other guy? Charles Brantley. They all shot him down right about the same time. For the rest of their lives, they argued about who shot the first one down. It never got resolved. So it was a very, very rare thing for one of our side without jets to have shot down a German jet, but they did it. They managed to do it. A big feat on their part. So the war ends. He actually was able to get, before the war ended, another Focke-Wulf that he shot down. So he got a couple of victories and everything, but that jet was a big deal. After the war, he received a doctorate from New York University, became president of the Bronx Community College and director of City University in New York, and kind of thought maybe that's enough. That photo right there captures Roscoe Brown in the middle, Lee Archer on that side, Charles McGee in the red jacket behind him, and Alex Jefferson right there, and Span Watson, you can just barely see him on the other side of Lee Archer. Those were 5 really top Tuskegee Airmen. This is Roscoe actually citing the painting I did. So Lee Archer, this is his class, which, he is the one kneeling down far on that side. So the graduation classes were getting bigger. Very few washouts anymore because these were all really good guys. When he went overseas, he joined them at the point where they were flying the P-39. This is a P-39 Airacobra with its car-like door, which always seems kind of out of place. Here he is in his Mustang. And that's holding on to the front of the Mustang. He had a lot of photos taken of him because he wound up being pretty spectacular. July 18th, 44, flying a P-51C. The C model had the early canopies. They didn't have the bubble canopy on them. He scored his first victory, a Messerschmitt 109. But in October of 44, there was a big, furious air battle over Hungary. It only lasted about 10 minutes. And he kept encountering Messerschmitts that were getting on his friends' tails. And the Messerschmitts weren't aware that he was back there. So he shot down 3 more Messerschmitts. Now, there's a very high likelihood he shot down another one, but the Air Force, the Army Air Force would never give him credit, because that would be a total of 5. And the greater Air Force did not want a Tuskegee Airman to be an ace. So they gave him a half. So he wound up with 4.5, so he was half away from becoming an ace, when in all reality he was an ace. But they're able to, historians were able to say no. So here he is with the crew chief, and the crew chief is probably the most important person in the airplane, with the airplane, because they're the one that makes certain that everything works on it. Because if you're a fighter pilot and the thing isn't working, it's no good. So here he is shooting a Messerschmitt down. I'm trying to remember who it was that was in the other Mustang. But this is a Mustang, painted up as his Mustang. This is in Florida. But I think one of the highest compliments of any of them is when somebody paints an airplane up in honor of them. And here's a painting I did. Don't tell anybody here, but this painting was for San Diego Air and Space Museum for their Hall of Fame. And Charles McGee. Charles is dead center, kneeling down, right in the middle. And he's also one of the very spectacular ones. He was in class 43F single engine. So 1943, second year that they were graduating, about mid-year, and single engine. And he was deployed to the 332nd Fighter Group when they were in Italy, and flew his first combat mission 1944 on Valentine's Day. Shortly after that, they gave up their P-39s, got the P-47 Thunderbolts. The reason for the P-47 Thunderbolt, it was such a sturdy airplane, it was great for ground attack. It could take a lot of hits and keep on flying, where a Mustang is liquid cooled, and once you've hit anything in the system where the fluid is, the engine's going to overheat. A Thunderbolt had an 18-cylinder engine that 2 of the cylinders actually could be shot off the engine, and the engine would still run. So a very durable airplane, so it was good for ground attack. 2 months into the whole thing, the whole mission changed, and they were now going to start flying escort missions, and they were given Mustangs. And that's the point where they started flying their beloved Mustangs and really excelling. The war ended with Charles having flown 137 combat missions. Returning to the States, he became a B-25 instructor pilot, because like everybody else, he stayed in. So he was an instructor pilot with the 477th Bomb Group. The 477th had been set up towards the end of the war with the intentions of first just B-25s, but then they changed it to a composite group with a squadron of Thunderbolts. They were all going to go to the Pacific. The war ended too soon. They never got there. There were a bunch of other things that happened that I won't go into. But after being an instructor pilot for a while, the Korean War started. He was deployed with the 67th Fighter Bomber Squadron. Went back to flying Mustangs because they needed ground attack. They didn't have Thunderbolts anymore in the Air Force, so they had Mustangs. So they wound up doing the ground attack role with P-51 Mustangs initially in the Korean War. He wound up flying 100 combat missions and survived it all. So at this point, he is at 237 combat missions between Korea and World War II. So still stays in. The Vietnam War happens. He's now a lieutenant colonel, and he was flying RF-4 photo reconnaissance Phantoms. When the Tet Offensive happened, he happened to be in the air over Saigon. They needed reconnaissance. He was the only one there. They kept him flying straight for about 3 days. He would come in and land. They'd put more film in the airplane, more fuel in the airplane, and give him a sandwich and some coffee and send him back up again. And he did that for 3 days straight because they needed the information. So he wound up surviving all that and flew a total between the three wars of 409 combat missions. And on February 4th, 2020, I think it was the day after he got to do the Toyn Cost Super Bowl, he was given his Brigadier General Star. And he died at the age of 102, but as a Brigadier General. Now, an entirely different path, but also quite important. I guess I should advance this, shouldn't I? Charles McGee. I keep forgetting to do this. If somebody wants to come up here and do this for me. There he is, very late in life. There he is getting his star. And Bob Ashby, he went in pretty late in the war, and by the time he got his wings, the war had ended. But he had already flown the PT-17 Stearman, the AT-6, the B-25, and did really well with the B-25. He was now a second lieutenant. War ended. He's one who decided to stay in because there were no opportunities. He wanted to fly, and he kept flying. They put him in training for T-33 after the whole 332nd was disbanded because of the gunnery meet. He got to fly jets, so they put him through T-33 training. He wound up flying B-45 Tornadoes, a real early twin-engine jet. Flew B-47 Stratojets, a really great jet. After 21 years in the Air Force, he retired with rank of lieutenant colonel. Decided he wanted to be an airline pilot. The airlines all said, no, sorry, you're very capable, but no. So he kept at it, applied with everybody, kept bugging him and everything. And he applied with Frontier Airlines. Frontier said, okay. So like the following day, he was on his way to Denver to start training for Frontier. And they were as good as their word. He became a Frontier captain, initially flying Convair 580 turboprops. Wound up flying Convair, the 580, Boeing 737, and MD-80s. There was one other Tuskegee Airman that briefly became, real early on, an airline pilot, but he was killed in a crash. Bob survived the whole thing very well, and that was back when airline pilots mandatorily had to retire at the age of 60. So all that time he was with Frontier Airline, and at 60 he retired and settled down living in Phoenix, and that's where I caught up with him. Very nice guy. And Bob Williams, I guess I should do this, should I? Oh, Bob Ashby. There's the B-25 that he was flying originally, later on. There's the B-47, just a super airplane. If you've seen the old Jimmy Stewart movie, Strategic Air Command, this is the star of the second half of the movie, the B-47. He also flew B-66 destroyers. And there's the Convair 580. And there's his Frontier Airlines 737. There he is, looking very happy in the cockpit of a 737. And that's the painting I did of him. Well, Bob Williams, there's his high school yearbook picture. And there he is, college days. And he was born in Ottumwa, Iowa. His father was a pilot, civilian pilot, and his father taught both sons how to fly. At that point, with the three Williams family members flying, the amount of black people that were flying with pilot's license were 102. And the war starts, he just decides to get in. It takes him a while and everything. But he ultimately became a pilot with the 100th Fighter Squadron within the 332nd, flying Mustangs. This is a picture of him in the ready room, listening to what they're going to have to do for the day. So there he is on this side. And another person who we had out here at the Air Museum a lot, we honored, was Ted Lumpkin. He's the one handing out all the survival gear and everything else. So we knew two of those guys. But Bob's the one over here, the good-looking young guy. While Bob was in combat, they flew one mission. Let's see, where was it? Oh, anyway, March 31st, 1945. So the war's getting closer to the end, but not quite there. They got into a very wide-ranging combat with the Germans. And in the midst of it, Bob shot down two Focke-Wulfs. And this is him right after the mission, right after he got out of the airplane, and everybody's congratulating him. And I got to know him pretty well, and I kind of always looked at his face, the big smile he's got, and it's kind of a smile of, I got two Germans, and I survived. So that surviving the whole thing is a big deal. Another photo from the same thing. Here's a painting I did, and this is also on the mural over there where, right somewhere on the mural. I haven't looked at it in a long time. Anyway, that's him on the mural. It's over there somewhere. Now, you wonder why that movie poster just showed up. After the war, he decided to write a screenplay about his experiences with the whole Tuskegee Airmen thing. And they weren't actually called the Tuskegee Airmen at that point. There's a fellow named Robert Francis who wrote a book about the whole thing, and he coined the phrase the Tuskegee Airmen. So by the time this came along, Bob had written the screenplay. At first it was not called Tuskegee Airmen. He tried to get a movie studio to do something with it for over 40 years. And at one point, CBS was thinking about doing something with it. And he lived in Pasadena, so he was close to all the studios and everything. So he was over there daily talking to them, and they were making grand plans and everything. And then, if you remember, Sony bought out CBS. And Sony, being a Japanese company and kind of on the wrong side of World War II, went, we don't want to have anything to do with this. So they gave it back to him. And several more years elapsed, and he made the right connections, started talking to HBO, and out of it came the Tuskegee Airmen movie for HBO. So that was written by Robert Williams, Bob. And he, unfortunately, was one of the early ones to pass away. He died at 75, had cancer. He had only been out here once, and at that point he was getting pretty ill. But he was a great guy. In his house in Pasadena, he had pictures up of all of his exploits and stuff, and there were pictures of him down in Mexico bullfighting. He was that type of guy. So, Rusty Burns, he was our local guy, lived in Palm Desert, and he's one on top row on this side that looks like he's kind of scowling. Actually, second one over. But kind of look about him. But Rusty was actually a super guy. So this is his graduation class at Tuskegee. There he is, closer up. And they got to the point where they were flying P-40s. Here's the P-40 Warhawk. That's what they got to fly around the skies of the southern states for a while before they deployed. And when they first deployed overseas, they were flying the P-40s. Rusty got his wings, started flying in the Army and everything right as the war ended. So he stayed in the Army for a little while, was flying Thunderbolts, decided to get out and do what he could. Everybody was saying, well, you're not going to be able to do anything flying-wise. He was able to buy an Aeronca Champ. That's what this is. And it needed to be rebuilt. He personally rebuilt the airplane in his garage. Was able to rent a hangar at Compton Airport and started giving flying lessons. Over the course of the next several years, he bought several more Aeronca Champs, rebuilt them all, and had a thriving business giving lessons, hired a couple of other instructor pilots. It was Rusty's Flying Service at Compton Airport. And he did that for quite a few years. To supplement his income, he bought a wreckage of a Stearman biplane and rebuilt it, started flying it at air shows. He also started flying in some of the movies and TV shows. There was a movie stunt pilot named Frank Tallman down at Orange County Airport, now John Wayne. And he started working with Frank Tallman, and he said Frank was fine. He gave him all the parts he could. He did some flying, and it's a Mad, 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 Mad World. That's the one movie I can remember. For the air shows, it'd be more spectacular to have somebody on top of the Stearman while you're doing aerobatics, rather than just simply doing aerobatics. It'd be even more spectacular if it was a young lady. And he said when he got that idea of doing that and started putting it out there to see if there was anybody that would be willing to do that, he said you would be amazed at how many young ladies were willing to be attached to the top wing of a Stearman while it's doing low-level aerobatics. He said there was never a shortage of young ladies willing to do that. And he said there were a couple of them that made offers to him that he just went, no. But, so that's how he was surviving. This is commemorating his time in the Army Air Force. This is 2008 at Moton Field at the opening. That's Rusty with Lee Archer. Rusty generally had that grin on his face. He was a very happy person. His first name was actually Isham, but he said when he was in school in LA, none of the teachers or anybody else could remember Isham. So one of the teachers started calling him Rusty, and it stuck. For the rest of his life, he was Rusty. That's Rusty in front of the administrative building at Tuskegee. And when he was, don't tell anybody. When he was in training there and he was a cadet, one night they were flying BT-13s, and they were in groups of 4 orbiting different areas around Tuskegee Army Airfield and waiting for their turn to go in and shoot landings at Tuskegee Army Airfield. So they're just tootling around, and if you knew Rusty, you'd know that he gets bored really easy. So he got bored while burning holes through the air, and he realized that he was right over Tuskegee University, and he kept seeing the clock tower go by. And if you know BT-13s, what he was flying, they can be really noisy. So on one pass, without anybody looking or anything, he came in real low, and he went right by that clock tower. And he said he was probably 10 feet away from the clock tower, and he put the prop into coarse pitch, and it made the airplane just growl. And everybody that had already gone to bed at Tuskegee University got a rude awakening. And he went right back up and acting like he hadn't done anything, and radio call came from Sector 4 or whatever it was. Everybody flying Sector 4, report to the CO's office as soon as you land. And he was going, oh no, what have I done? And they all got hauled in there, the 4 of them, and the CO said, somebody just did something, and you know what it was, and you got to tell us right now what you did. And Rusty's kind of like, if I speak up, I'm going to get thrown out. So Colonel Parrish kind of yelled at him for about 10 minutes and then said, I'll give you 3 days to fess up to the whole thing, or I'm going to wash out all of you. Get out of here. So they're all walking back to their barracks, and they're all kind of going, oh my God, what happened? And Rusty said, I got to confess to you guys, I buzzed the clock tower. And they went, oh, that's what it was. And, well, we won't say anything. And they were going to just mum's a word. They weren't going to admit to anything. They weren't going to say, Rusty did it, or anything. And that weighed on Rusty. Rusty didn't sleep for a couple of nights. And on the 3rd morning, he went in and to Noel Parrish's office, Colonel Parrish, and told the secretary, I've got to talk to the colonel for a moment. And Colonel Parrish kept him standing there for about 15 minutes. And Rusty said he knew that Colonel Parrish knew it was him all along. And that's why he kept him just standing there. So the secretary said, oh, you can go in. He went in there, and Colonel Parrish kept writing things down, spent another 15 minutes or so of Rusty standing there at attention with sweat coming out of his brow and everything else. And finally looked up and said, Burns, I knew it was you all along. And Rusty said, yeah, it was me. And he got the riot act read to him for another 10 minutes or so. And then, much to Rusty's surprise, Colonel Parrish said, if you ever do anything like that again, you're out of here. Go behave yourself. And Rusty, leaving there, was ready to go pack his bags, but he was still in the Army Air Force. So he went back and told everybody that nobody's going anywhere, he's fine and everything. And it was about that time that word came down that the clock had stopped in the clock tower. When he buzzed it, it was noisy enough that it stopped the clock. Now, when we were there in 2008, we found a couple of really old people that had been there a long time. And Rusty said, how long did the clock not work? And they, oh, it didn't work for a long time. The university finally got the money together and had a clock specialist come out and got the clock running about 10 years ago. And Rusty was about to say, well, I did that, when he kind of went, I'd better not. So he kept it to himself, and I kind of, no. There's Rusty just about 10 years ago signing a painting that I had done. And as you might remember, back just a handful of years ago, all of them together were awarded the Congressional Medal, gold medal. So it's for the entire unit. And there is the medal. And there they are, being awarded the medal. So I could keep going for days with all this, but I won't. So I'll knock it off at this point. I think it's been an hour anyway. So anyway, that's it. Thank you.